Is the landscape of the Western Front our last witness of the Great War? Can what lies beneath those battlefields tell us more about how those battles were fought? And what is the geology of mud, of chalk, of rock? These are all things that we uncover this week in our latest trench chat on the Old Front Line. Welcome to another trench chat on the Old Front Line. I'm really pleased this week to be joined by Professor Peter Doyle, author of some incredible books on the First World War, and one in particular that I like, which is Disputed Earth, about the geology of the First World War. So, as landscape and the meaning of landscape and the importance of landscape is so important to really what this podcast is about, with visits along the Western Front and other battlefields, Peter, I thought we'd have a little bit of a chat about that this week. You know, when we look at the meaning of the landscape, often in the discussion of it, the geology is the missing element. Why do you think that is, and why is it so important?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Paul. And I think what's really interesting is that if you look back over the writing about the Western Front, and you go back to perhaps some of the classics like The Old Front Line by Masefield, they all talk about the significance, the importance, the meaning of the battlefields, what they meant to the soldiers and what they mean to people who visit them today. But I think one of the missing aspects to that is how did that landscape form, and how did the landscape have an effect on the everyday lives of the soldiers? I think both you and I are absolutely fascinated in trying to understand and striving to understand what it was like for the soldiers of the Western Front. And I think this is what your podcasts are all about. And I think that's certainly something that I've been striving to do for all of the time that I've been interested in, is try and understand what exactly it felt like, how exactly it was. And I think geology, a very fundamental thing, a science, perhaps puts people off a little bit. Maybe it seems a little bit too remote, and yet you can't get more intimate than digging your way into 6 foot, 2 meters of trench. You're getting straight down into the rock, the clay, the soils, and you are experiencing it right there. So I think a lot of people have been anxious about that, and many people glibly talk about landscape without really understanding how it formed, what it meant, and it's understandable. But obviously my mission, one of the things that I'm really keen on, is making sure that we perhaps see beyond just the surface and we understand exactly what's going on. And that's the purpose of the work that I've been trying to achieve.
And I suppose that really, if you like you say, when we're discussing trench warfare, I mean, geology really dictates the conditions under which these battles of the First World War are fought.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think what's really interesting is it's always exciting, for me anyway, when I come across writers, both contemporary writers just after the First World War or during the First World War, when they make absolute reference to that. And one of the astounding things really is when you read the official history of the First World War and the Western Front in particular, and you read Edmund's book. I appreciate it was published in the 1940s. We read Edmund's book on the 1917 campaigns, and particularly Passchendaele. What's really fascinating about that, bear in mind Edmunds is, a general. He's somebody who is writing the history of the war. He's looking at it in a balanced way. And he writes as a preface or a foreword or something of that ilk. And he writes very much about the nature of the landscape. He considers the landscape of France and Flanders in particular, and he looks at some of the mythology that had developed about the trench warfare and about the mud that had been developed. And one of the really interesting things for me, it's probably passed over by many people, is that he makes an absolute statement that the area around Ypres is not, or was never, a swamp. It is something different. He's talking about the swampy conditions that you get at the coast, but not necessarily swampy conditions that you get around Ypres. And he's saying that and this really excited me as a geologist, he said it probably could have been like that during the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs, but not during the time just immediate to the soldiers that came in. I think many writers subsequent to Edmunds have either ignored that or forgot it and have written extensively about that. And you can understand why. If we just look at those photographs of the Western Front, those fascinating photographs, the crisp imagery that we get of the horrific landscape of shell blasted and water filled craters, and you think, how could that have been, and what was controlling it? And I think what Edmonds was striving to do was to try and say it's a little bit more than you might imagine. And I think that's again where I've been interested to try and engage with that. So trench warfare in its static form really does have an absolute engagement with that landscape, and understanding a little bit more is really what it's all about for me.
And talking of Flanders, I thought that we'd perhaps try and sort of put this into some perspective by taking three vaguely geological elements and connecting them to bits of the Western Front: mud, chalk, and rock. And we'll start with major mud. And as you mentioned, Flanders. Now, I mean, Flanders is the landscape that we think of when we think of the First World War, and we think of the swamp, as you've described it in those crisp photographs. But it was an important element of how that war progressed there, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There are some texts and books that are written on mud and mud in warfare. There's plenty of considerations of the Mud March, for example, which is only to the Civil War. There are other aspects of mud, and how mud itself becomes a major contributory factor to warfare. And I think it's really interesting to look at Flanders. Why is Flanders so fought over? Well, it's not just because of the situation. It's also because it's flat. It's capable of being maneuvered over. It's between a corridor between the Ardennes, which are a little bit more upland. Obviously, we saw in the Second World War that was no barrier necessary to the panzers that thrust through, but even so, it was considered to be a barrier. So between the Ardennes and the coast, you have the relatively flat land in Flanders, both the French Flanders, the area around Luce and those places, and out, of course, to the coast. So we really see a manoeuvring area. Now, I'm sitting here in London, and underneath my feet, in fact, right at the bottom of my garden floods at the bottom. The reason for that is because of the clay, which is literally an inch down underneath the soil. We can't really grow potatoes down there. And that clay is absolutely the same clay. So there's no distinction. It's not just the same type of clay, it's actually the same layer of clay as we get in Flanders. And so what we have there is this incredibly rich clay layer, which is heavy going and thick, which of course becomes glutinous if you mix it with too much water, but in itself it repels water. So if you have flooding at the bottom of your garden like me because of the clay, the reason for that is the water sits on top of that clay. It's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to sit there. And that's why you use puddle clay in pools and ponds and what have you. So there you go. You've got this essence of the clay plain of Flanders, which goes pretty much over much of Flanders right up to Dixmude. And what we see there is that that clay plain is liable to have water sitting on it. So if you go to the area around Zillebeek, which is south of Ypres, and what we see there in Zillebeek are the Zillebeek Lakes. They've been there for, during the war, and they're there now. They sit entirely on clay. That is, so the soldiers of the First World War in and around Ypres would get their water or access their water, not from wells necessarily, but actually from surface water. So you can sit on the clay plain. So you can imagine what that was like. That surface water is likely to get contaminated. As you go further north to the coast, in Dixmude, and you get something called the polders. This is the area that was flooded during the Ice Age. And so what we can see there is if we have sea level change in the future, that's the place that's likely to be flooded again. And so from Dixmude to the belts of sand dunes at the coast, the sand dunes protect that part of the coast and they protect it from floods. But you can imagine that if we have major sea level rise in the future, the Dixmude and that area, Newport down to Dixmude, is going to be flooded once again. And that, of course, was itself a munition of war when the King of the Belgians gave permission for the lockkeeper at Newport to open the gates and allow that area to be flooded, and that stopped the Germans in their tracks and allowed the Belgian army to stand on the defense of the Yser. So from that part, that was held by the Belgians and by that water. And then in the clay plain, you see the trenches being dug into this clay. And once you start to dig excavations into the clay, if you're going to be digging a pond in your garden and you've got clay underneath, then of course you dig an excavation, you fill it with water, and hey presto, it stays there. If you start digging holes in the ground, trenches and dugouts, likelihood is the water's going to fill those. And I think what's amazing today, as you know, Paul, in your investigations of that and along environment engagement with Flanders, is that the farmers there, they use the dugouts, the old dugouts, they know where they are. They're filled to the brim with water. They use them for water as a reservoir for their animals and what have you. That's because it's like a container within the clay. So in many ways, it's perfect to dig in, perfect to create tunnels, just the same as the London clay allows the London Underground. But needless to say, getting rid of the water once it's pooled on the top, that's a real challenge. And of course, that's why those very, very subtle ridges that we have, Passchendaele and Messines and the other areas around that, Hill 62 Sanctuary Ward, Tall Top, all those locations, they are very, very subtle changes in the landscape, but they have slightly different geology. And what's really interesting is that many of those then meant that there were challenges and advantages to the Germans. The challenges were that actually they couldn't dig down into the clay where the British were operating, because the layers were so rich in water sat on top of the clay that, of course, once they dug their tunnels down, quite often you got a fountain of water coming out, and that was a challenge. And the advantage, of course, is because they had the high ground, which allowed them to look at everybody operating down on the clay plain of Flanders. So it's a very complex business, I think. And what fascinates me is, of course, that, you know, obviously I'm going to be interested in it, but the armies of both sides, of all sides, were fascinated by it because they had engineers and experts and geologists and everybody else who could advise. The ubiquitous engineer was everywhere, and wherever the engineer went, he knew what to do and how to handle that ground. It was the poor bloody infantry that had to dig it, of course, but they were expecting that to happen when the RE turned up.
So what that meant then was that if you were Fritz on top of the hill and PBI in the flatlands below, you were both just as wet as each other. You weren't necessarily...
You were, and yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Paul. There's one amazing story of, you'll have seen, and you know very well from your photographic collection, of the Prussian officers that look absolutely super smart with very high collars, incredibly tailored uniforms with the Iron Cross First Class and all the rest of it, you know, beautifully turned out, these guys. Their equivalent of the PBI, of course, a little bit more scruffy, lads in the trenches. And there's this amazing story about how when they were digging, I think it was Petit Bois, but it may have been somewhere else, when the Germans were digging down in through the layers to try and countermine the British with their mines. They were digging down, and this Prussian officer turned up and said, you know, why aren't you chaps digging it deeper or faster or what have you? And he peered over down into the shaft just as this great plume of dirty water came up, because the pressure of the water got so much that they kind of got a gushing, like those oil gushers of the 1950s and 60s. And you can imagine, can't you, what the average German engineer thought when he saw his Prussian officer covered in muddy water. That was the end of his beautiful uniform. So I think you're right. There are disadvantages and advantages, and both sides had challenges. It really came to play, of course, as we know, when the mine warfare started, because the British and French were at a complete advantage because they could dig into this clay and they could undermine the German conditions. The Germans had to dig through these layers and create problems like we saw at Petit Bois. To create problems like that, to dig down and to countermine, they had lots and lots of challenges. And that's probably one of the reasons why the British, in effect, won the mine warfare battle, certainly in Messines.
And the connection with London that you mentioned before, that had an effect on the men, the tunnellers from our side, and the type of war that they fought, because Norton Griffiths and his men were already experienced in working in clay.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, Norton Griffiths is become legendary, of course. And what Norton Griffiths, as a civil engineer, he had men working wherever there was clay. So not only the clay of London, but also the clay, different clay, but a clay nevertheless in Manchester, digging sewers. And they developed, I think is what you're alluding to, they developed a technique which allowed them to cut through that clay very rapidly, something called clay kicking, which sees the men lying back on a kind of cross-like affair and kicking into the face and then kicking down a big clod of earth. And so they were able to use gravity to their benefit. They were able to use kicking into the ground and create these big clods, which were then carried out. The Germans, as far as I'm aware, didn't use that technique. They used pick and shovel. The Germans had a long history of mining. Of course, in many ways, they could claim to be the origin of mineral mining from Bavaria and other places back in the distant time. But I think there was a different approach to it. And I think therefore Norton Griffiths' clay kickers were bringing a new technique, and they could cut through that ground really rapidly. And I think that's become somewhat legendary now. There's a great deal of interest in mine warfare. And ultimately, it's not just a sort of, right, lads, let's dig a hole in the ground. It is, right, lads, let's dig a hole in the ground. These are the conditions. This is the type of clay. This is the amount of time it's going to take us to drive the gallery. This is the level of support that we have to give to that. This is the amount of effort we have to put in getting rid of the clay. In fact, we start to see the First World War becoming a war of specialists. I've always said to anybody who's willing to listen that pretty much it's a battle between the engineers and the artillery, with the PBI in the middle, because clearly the engineers are trying to outwit the artillery, or to try and get underneath the ground. The artillery are trying to destroy the engineers and make sure they don't do that, and the PBI are there to take with boots on the ground to take the lines. So it's a really interesting technological battle, one which is fought beneath ground as above it. So the very same cat and mouse battles that were fought with Bloody April and what have you going on over the front with the Fokkers and all the rest of that. Similar kind of battles were being fought, technological battles underneath. So I know both you and I striving to understand what it's like for the soldiers to fight there. But what's really interesting is that the battlefront is not just that old front line, it's beneath it and above it. And it's the battle space, I think that's a phrase that we can use these days, is huge in that way, and it's technological. So that's why I'm kind of interested in from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we think of a battle like Passchendaele, and we read the accounts of not just men sinking in the mud, but horses and mules and guns and even tanks, some people find it difficult to believe that was possible, but it was, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about that is that we tend to paint a broad brush. So we tend to think of the First World War through the lens of the photographs, which are absolutely incredible. And those photographs give us an image of the horrendous conditions in there. One of the things that I worked on some years ago was looking at the panoramic photographs of the Western Front, and particularly of Passchendaele and other locations. And what's really interesting is that you see that that destroyed battlefront that we all expect to see. And yet, if you look on the panoramas beyond that, you see the fields and the trees and all the rest of that going on. It's almost like lockdown. Nothing's happened there. The dead cows, the farms that are gradually decaying, and all the rest of that. That is what's happening. I think that's probably why, I know we both share an appreciation of the film 1917. I think that's why, in many ways, people have real problems understanding 1917, because they expect the whole thing to be shell blasted in the whole location. And yet when they go through that, they come into a different world altogether. And I think the Passchendaele's experience then is about understanding nuances and detail. And when you look at the battlefield, and one of the reasons why it was effective in some parts and not in others is because of the lie of the land, different slope angles, the positioning of rivers and beaks, streams, and the rest of it. And of course, and how those things really had an effect. So if you look at the use of tanks, the tank, I'm not a tank specialist, but I do find tanks fascinating, as many people do. And I think there's a lot of criticism. Why did Haig use tanks, or why didn't he? I've always thought, if you have a battle where you are in charge and you have the possibility of a battle or war winning machine, you're telling me you're not going to commit that? I find that strange. If you look at the way that the tank corps used specialist engagements. There was a guy called Colin Hardy, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but he did an amazing study looking at, he called them the reconographers, looking at the geographic engagement, how tank corps officers looked at the landscape and mapped out where bits were heavy going and bits were not. And if you stuck to the bits that weren't, you could probably drive your tank over that. If you went into, or you slipped off into an area of soft or boggy ground, you were done for. And I think those lessons were used, yes, sparingly. Maybe it was the first time that that was done in Passchendaele, but certainly later in the war. And if you look at what happened at Dieppe in the 1940s, when you see how the tanks bogged in, and then in 1944 you see how then those tanks were fully engaged and understood exactly what was beneath their tracks, then you see what's happening here. And that really is down to what the tankies call going surfaces. How easy is it to get going over that, and how easy is it to bog in? And that's what we had in those trenches, in that trench warfare battle. So I think it's easy for us to say, look at that. How could you commit tanks to that? Why would you put men in it? You know, like the classic story of the guy weeping, the general weeping because of the conditions. I can quite understand how it must have felt, even though I know it's mythologized. But equally, it's not always the same, and every single nuanced element is different. And when you look at the work that the engineers and the technological experts did to combat that at all levels, it is really telling, and it's really interesting to engage with that.
A mention of 1917 nicely brings us on to the next bit of geological substance, which is chalk. And it's interesting what you say about people's perception of what a First World War battlefield should look like. 1917 did challenge that quite a lot, as you say. And by chalk, obviously, we connect that to the Somme, but the Champagne region is another area where the French army was. That brings with it its own problems as well, I would expect.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, what's really fascinating about it? So, if you go south, if you go south, and you end up southwest of Luce, and you're going to get to the Vimy Ridge. And again, people have conceptual difficulties knowing which side were on the Vimy Ridge, where were people attacking on that side, and what's really interesting, you know, which slope were you going up? The point about Vimy Ridge is it's a major fracture in the Earth's surface. There are lots and lots of fractures, so-called faults, and these are things which move. So one side moves up relative to the other. So the reason why there's a ridge there, or pretty much a sort of escarpment ridge, is because the Earth is fractured and it's left what we call a fault scarp, i.e. Quite a steep slope on one side, because the Earth has dropped down. And what we see is that while one part drops down, and that's the area around Lus and the area around that, as we go on the other side of that, we start to see Vimy and the ridge and how it is higher. Same with the Notre Dame de Lorette, which is on the other side. Again, you have these two uplifted areas because of these faults. And what that does is it brings to the surface older rocks. So beneath the clay, the muddy clay that we've been describing, is the chalk. So these are layers of Earth history, if you like. And they're exposed at the surface by what we call tectonics, you know, earth movements. Earthquakes, if you like. And so what's brought chalk to the surface in that area from Vimy through Artois and Picardy is these sort of earth movements. And we get at the surface there this incredible white stuff. Now, I'm a lad from Northern England, so I came down to London to do my degree. I'd never seen the chalk in reality. I knew what chalk was, but actually to go and see, I'd never seen the White Cliffs of Dover. I'd never seen anything like that. So when I actually saw this stuff, I thought, what is that? Because it is so starkly white. You think, how could this be? And what it is, you know, you are much more comfortable with that, Paul, having from Sussex, I believe, that right? And I think, you know, that's much more in your blood than it is for me. I was born on clay, so, you know, I perhaps understand that a bit more. And the landscape, the flowing landscape of the Downs, which is absolutely moving to anybody who sees it, both me as a Northerner and you as a native. You know, you can see that beautiful landscape, those rolling hills, and those rolling hills are formed by the act of flowing water and also of ice age activity, which is scrape the surface and produce these beautiful rolling downs. And that's what you've got, exactly the same chalk. It links with the chalk in Sussex and Kent, and you have that in Artois and Picardy. Now, what's really interesting about that chalk is, again, those of you, and you'll know this, Paul, that know the chalk, is that valleys are often dry. They don't have any water flowing through them. And the reason for that is that the water soaks away into the chalk and it dissolves the chalk away and creates caves and other underground features. So that meant, remember I said that the soldiers in Flanders would find their water in pools on the clay. Well, the soldiers in Artois and Picardy had real problems in getting water. So they had water specialists who dug loads of boreholes to find water to dig these wells. And so in Artois and Picardy, you get small villages, small hamlets clustered around I can't remember what they're called now, but anyway, boreholes basically. And these boreholes are managed by the local community, and those are the things which provide the water. So each of these small hamlets, you know, Ocean Villas and all of those, Beaumont-Hamel, they would all have their own water supply from these things. So that means, therefore, that you're not going to get the same conditions as you get in Flanders. Now, this is one of the problems, though. People go, yeah, hold on a minute. What about the famous book, Some Mud by Lynch? What about the conditions at Beaumont-Hamel, you know, the classic photograph of Bean wading through the trench with mud up to his waist? And I would say, aha, the reason for that is because on top of the white chalk, there are a whole set of other layers, and they're from the Ice Age period. Again, if you're from southern England, you'll be used to something called brick earth, used for making bricks. And this was a material that was blown around during the Ice Age, in between the period when there were glaciers. And it was sort of like a dust, and it settles everywhere and creates these big layers. And then on top of that, you get other kind of layers of loam and what have you. So if you go to the Somme and you track your way along the battlefront there, you'll see parts of it where you have this reddish, orangish, clayey soil, and parts of it where the chalk is exposed. So you can imagine, can't you? You're digging a trench in the white chalk, you know, like the White City near Hawthorne Ridge. It's called the White City by the lads because it's clearly evidently white. The chalk trenches are so luminous. And of course, any, you know, your average Fokker flying above would go, okay, lads, they're digging trenches there, so let's keep an eye on that. Whereas in other parts, you're looking at a much more clay-rich environment, and you'll see that in, you know, sort of areas around Mametz and so on and so forth. It really varies according to where you are on the Somme, and the Somme rolling curves will expose the chalk and have white trenches, or will expose this sort of clay stuff, brick earthy stuff, which gets very, very glutinous with very, very difficult conditions. So by the end of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, with the rains and with the winter conditions, that's when you have the mud of the Somme, and that's where the legend of Somme mud, I mean, legend, it is a true aspect, but, you know, it has become legendary as that. So it's a very different set of conditions, and it also means very different conditions to digging trenches and dugouts, as you can imagine.
And with the difference in the terrain there, with chalk against the Flanders clay, that also dictates the way that the mining war beneath the Western Front is fought in those conditions.
Totally, absolutely so. So I think what's really interesting is you're looking at, with the clay kickers, what they're doing is they're sort of kicking into the clay and big clods are coming out, and it's fairly uniform all the way through. It's not hard rock, but anybody that's dug anything in clay, you'll know how heavy going that is. So they were using gravity to assist that. When you're digging through the chalk obviously stands up on its own right. You don't have to use as many timber beams and what have you. But as you're digging through that, then you're going to need different tools. So you'll need picks to be able to dig through that and to take out those. And I think one of the interesting differences between the mining in the north, in the clay plain, and the mining in the south, particularly in the chalk, is that you are seeing difference in these tools and difference in terms of sound propagation. Now, when mine warfare first started, when we were talking way back in millennia almost, what you notice as you're working through that, the underground sound travels very rapidly, and it can travel for some distance. So one of the reasons why clay kicking was so successful is it was actually relatively silent. So that miners on the other side would be mining themselves to try and combat those mines that were heading towards them. And I think if you go to Dover Castle, or one of the major castles in and around Britain, you will notice, particularly of that era, the Palmerston Folly forts as well, they all have galleries which go outwards as listening posts. So they're always thinking about the possibility of being undermined. And both Dover Castle has some of those amazing ones, or Fort Nelson. Again, you can see some of those in action. So what's happening in the clays, you can dig quite deeply, and you can dig at length, and you can be relatively silent if you use clay kicking. On the Somme, classic photographs of men using picks and shovels, that's going to allow noise to travel, and that means therefore you're at risk there from the enemy listening in and hearing what you're saying and understanding and trying to pinpoint you, and therefore countermining becomes a major matter of concern. And I think one of the things which picks out the chalk is, again, if you're used to seeing chalk, and you'll know that there are these flint nodules. I won't go into the detail of why you've got flint there. I can do, but we haven't got that much time. But the reality is that those things are really super hard. You know, that we use for flint tools. You hit one of those with a pick, and that's going to ring really loudly. And I think the transfer of that noise through the ground must have made it incredibly tense for those men digging those mines on the Somme, for example. And I think it's really interesting, as you said, Paul, going down into the Champagne. The Champagne region is, again, sort of chalky. It's not the same chalk, it's different. And the flat plain that you see there, and of course the slopes, which allow for the incredible landscape of the Champagne. If you've never been, you must go, because I know you have, Paul, but your listeners may not have done. It's a phenomenal location. And there, the chalky soil is a different type of limestone, but again, very chalky in many ways. And the flat plain is creating there a maneuverable location, which, of course, saw the Nivelle campaign peter out in the face of what it was, attacking. But I mean, the reality of these is that they're drier, the capability of digging mines and mine warfare, capability of big tunnels and dugouts. And if we think about the Somme, again, one of the most important mythological aspects of the Somme is how the Germans dug deep dugouts. It's always expressed, even now, as if how dastardly, how dare they dig deep dugouts? And isn't this terrible? And, that meant that when we went over the top, our brave boys, they faced us. Well, the Germans were there to hold the line, and they created something which is of spectacular engineering skill. That's not to say that the Allies didn't have that, but they had a different imperative. So it was only as the latter part of the war they had this. And of course, it's also perfect for moving tanks over dry ground, fairly firm, hence Cambrai and other locations where they were able to use tanks at Hamel, and of course, during that, and Amiens also, 8th August. So yeah, amazing difference between the two parts of France and Flanders.
Well, moving on to our third element then, rock. And I'm thinking in particular of places like Le Lange and down in the Vosges. Yeah. I mean, how did that work? How did you fight? I mean, you look at the trenches there, cut into rock. It's incredible.
Well, one of the things, in fact, it's a location that I haven't visited, Paul, so it's something that I need to do. I think if we look at it in a different perspective, you think about where the main battlefront was, the main area to fight. There's an area to hold on the defense, and it's an area where you need to hold the line. France was not going to give up 1 centimeter of its soil to the Germans, and so you need to hold that line and to make sure that the Germans don't, in many ways, break through. So you need to hold them on the defense. The Germans, of course, in their part, were holding the Allies in the defensive, or trying to hold the Allies in the defensive, in Flanders and on the Somme, and that's where they were expecting the attack to come. when we go down into the Vosges and the other areas where we're looking at, again, limestone predominantly, hard rock conditions, very different than the situation that we get in and around the Somme, of course, with this relatively soft white chalk. What they're doing is trying to create fortresses that would prevent any breakthrough whilst the main battles were being fought. From the Allies' perspective in Flanders and in France. Of course, the Germans were trying to hold the whole thing undefensive while they fought the Russians to a standstill. Now, if you think about geology and warfare, it's wherever you choose to fight a battle will definitely have an impact. If you go to the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the Battle of Culloden was fought at a place called Drumrossie Moor by Bonnie Prince Charlie. You may not know about this, listeners, but in any case, it's a moor. It's very, very boggy, very peaty, and one of the main shock tactics that the Highlanders had was the Highland Charge, with these very energized and highly offensive in terms of offensive action. Highlanders charging at you with their claymores and all the rest of that. Now that completely was destroyed by the fact that they chose to fight it on basically a peat bog, which meant that the energy of that charge was completely dissipated. If you look then at fortress locations, and what you're trying to do is to construct a fortress that would keep the enemy at bay. When you look at the fortress that was the Alpine region and the Dolomites, which is the border between Austria-Hungary and Italy. That was pretty much a defensive wall, which contained trenches at height, mine warfare into rock and glaciers to try and blow the enemy up. But basically, you're holding the enemy while you're fighting the war at their equivalent of Flanders, which is down in the Trentino, Zonzo front, where they fought many, many battles. So the Vosges, they're presenting an image there of having a fortress. And what that means then is you have to dig into solid rock. And I find this fascinating. The idea of using jackhammers, tools, engineering tools in order to construct trenches is something which, I don't know, maybe fascinates me too much. I don't know, but it is incredible. I'll never forget seeing a film called Desert Victory, which actually I think you can get streamed online, which is all about the preparations for El Alamein. And one of the phenomenal things there is that you see the Commonwealth troops digging trenches in hard rock surfaces using jackhammers. And again, I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. That's exactly what they had to do in the hard rock conditions of the Vosges and also in the Alpine. And you can see these sort of jackhammer compressed air tools that they had to use. Now, one of the problems they've got with this is you build these trenches, they're very, very, strong. They've had to expend a huge amount of energy on it. But the difference is when a shell hits in Flanders, the chances are it may dig into the ground. And chances are, obviously, it will produce a shower of, the storm of steel, a shower of shell shards. If you have something, but, the effect will be relatively limited compared to what might happen if you're firing a shell at a rock trench. Because not only do you have the shower of steel shards, you also have the shower of rock shards, very similar to what happens in the Napoleonic Wars. In the Napoleonic Wars, if you're firing your cannonballs at ships, what you're hoping to do is to create splinters, and those of wood, and those splinters are anti-personnel weapons. If you think about Nelson, he lost an eye or damaged an eye because of a rock splinter from one of his campaigns. I can't remember which one, with Nile or, I don't know, one of those, which had a cannonball hit rock, and those splinters of rock, very, very harsh splinters, again, are a weapon of war. So you've not only got the energy to dig those trenches, the having to transport all of the equipment up to reasonably high mountains or upland areas, or to create precarious footholds in those very, very steep pieces of ground formed during again, mountain building and earth movements of millennia ago. You've also got the additional threats of what happens when shells and munitions hit those rocks, and the splinters that come off them are, again, life-threatening in many ways. So hence, it's probably sensible they kept it on a defensive, but that's not to say that life and death in those trenches was no worse, no better than any other location. It must have just been different. And for each one of those soldiers that served there, it must have been phenomenal and terrifying, the same as any other location.
And when we bring those sort of three elements together, then sort of with mud and chalk and rock, in many respects, hearing you talk about it, it's almost as if the geology is another enemy on the battlefield. That it's if you're the PBI Tommy facing Fritz and the Fritz facing the Tommies, you've actually got something else that you've got to consider, and that's the environment around you.
Absolutely true. I suppose you could see it as an enemy and a friend. I think what the thing we're looking at here, and this is why it is so fascinating to somebody like myself, is that once we have open warfare, the landscape becomes the geology of the landscape. Yes, it's significant. It forms the landscape, and then the average intelligent commander can use that effectively, and that is part of the doctrine of anybody fighting war over those landscapes. So they understand what it was about. You look at Clausewitz, you look at Shen Zhu, those guys are always talking about the landscape, the terrain and aspects, and so geology contributes to that. But as soon as you start building fortresses, and bear in mind, as we know, the Western Front is a massive fortress, then you really need to understand what's going on there. And as soon as you're static, that means you are very much under threat of the varying conditions. So one piece of the line may be completely different than the next, and that could just be a matter of yards. And so it's the randomness of trench warfare, and the loss of life, which comes from that randomness. A dip in the line, a slightly boggy area that you don't want to walk through, so you go over the top just to take a risk. You get complacent about a particular trench. All of those things conspired against people not being vigilant, and those are all pretty much controlled by the elements. So if you not only have the geology, but you also have the environmental conditions, the rain, the water, and so on, again, it shows you how much of a challenge they had. I mean, again, another example is that if you were on a slope and you have a muddy trench and you find that your enemy is pumping its water down the slope towards you so you can fill your trench up. Again, it seems like not playing cricket, but it's part of the munitions of war. And I think it is therefore an advantage and a disadvantage. And I think knowing that, you can't just go blindly into it. You go blindly into it, you'll have some success, but ultimately it will conspire against you. You really need to understand those conditions. And I think that's why it is, again, significant to try and reconstruct that and to understand it.
So listening to what you say, I mean, it's quite clear that geology really did matter, both then and in our understanding of it now. But at the time, did enough people listen, do you think, to the geologists?
Well, it's a really interesting point. And I think the research that's been done on this and looked at whether or not there have been specialists engaged in an understanding the ground. What interests me about generalship and generals in general is if you look at Montgomery, again, a controversial figure for many reasons, but as far as my reading of it is Montgomery, of course, gathered together all of his experts. And I once met an elderly gentleman some years ago now who was a statistician. He said he had an amazing war. He came over D-Day +6 or something. He sat in a caravan next to Monty. He had an analog computer, and he worked out the distribution of trucks and what have you through that. I doubt if he ever shot his pistol. I doubt if he ever saw an enemy other than a prisoner. But the principle there is that you have a specialist, and that specialist is advising, and then the general or the field marshal makes the decision, and they make decisions based on a variety of different aspects. If we look at the First World War, we're looking at a time when boffins in uniform were not as common as that. And so we went to war, the British went to war, the French went to war, and the Germans went to war, and others with specialists. Yeah, they had their engineers, and the engineers had some military training in the use of geology. But as the war unfolded, so they realized they needed to get more specialists. So the British Army had ultimately 4 or 5 geologists who operated and had, some of them were lieutenants, one was a colonel, but they operated independently. They were able to advise a brigadier general, who therefore had some clout. So of those 4 or 5 geologists that were deployed by the British, they were everywhere. They looked at water supply, they looked at conditions for field hospitals and drainage, they looked at mine warfare, they engaged with understanding what it was like locally, and there's some amazing stories from them. The Germans, arguably a country where the science of geology was born, had something like 250 geologists employed. In fact, they came up with the term of Kriegsgeologie, the war geology or military geology or geology, whichever way you want to look at it, different phraseologies. And this was somebody called Walter Krantz, who identified 5 different things that geologists could do, you know, with water principally, with trenches, with identification of mineral resources, and so on and so forth. So they went to war equipped with that knowledge. As the war developed, of course, they brought more and more men into the army and more men who could advise. The difference between the 250 men serving with the German army and the 5 or so men serving with the British army is that the German ones were mostly sergeants or very junior lieutenants. And they had to go through the structure of, you know, talking to the captain, who would then talk to the major, who would then talk to the colonel. Whereas for the British Army, Lieutenant Bill King, who was in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers as an infantryman, was a geologist, went on to become a professor of geology in Birmingham University and beyond. That guy was able to talk as a lieutenant to a brigadier general who started the war by saying, and he said this in 1919, beginning of the war, why do we need geologists? Why do we even need to think about this? By the end of the war, he fully knew why, and these men were used. So I think the British had the capability for their officers, the specialist officers, to be roving and to have a major impact and to cascade that, to use the phrase, down through that. Whereas the Germans had to start from the bottom up and were guys who could use their knowledge and experience, but it didn't propagate throughout the army and therefore had some problems with that. And I don't think that it was effective as much as you see with the British Army, despite the number of geologists. So it was listened to. Come the end of the war, guess what happens? No geologists in the British Army. 1939, oops, we might need one of those too. And Bill King becomes a geologist once again for the British Army. Post-Second World War, let's forget about it. And then, of course, now we have an establishment, territorial force, auxiliary force, who are geologists, and you can follow one on Twitter, Soccer Geologist. I mean, there are many of them now, but this is typical of the British, you know, learn it, forget it, learn it, forget it, learn it, forget it. Let's hope that the lessons ultimately will be learned. Certainly the Germans have learned it. They have very well-equipped Geology unit, which I've had the pleasure of talking to and guiding around Flanders.
And I mean, it's obvious that geology is so important in warfare. But do you think that the First World War created a unique situation in terms of the geology and how it affected battles and conditions?
I would say so, clearly, because of my absolute fascination with the First World War. But if I wanted to look objectively upon it, if you look at other campaigns which have involved warfare, and I've had the pleasure of being engaged in a number of considerations of battlefronts. I've looked at the Apache Wars, for example, in a series called Battlefield Detectives, who look at a battle in New Mexico, where the Apache general, Julio, who was absolutely the master of his landscape and of the battlefield, it came as a real surprise to me that the Apaches weren't the horse soldiers that we thought that they were. They fought their campaigns against the invaders as they saw them through the use of fortresses, trenches, sangars, and ambush tactics. They knew the ground, they knew how to use the ground. And there you have an example of an innate understanding of the landscape and of the nature of the ground. What the Apaches call the rocks, I have no idea, but they will have had names for different aspects of that. And they use that to great effect. If you look at clearly other campaigns in the American Civil War, where we see the development of trench warfare, they did have geologists attached. They did use that, and Gettysburg has been looked at in depth at the nature of the terrain and the geology. But the problem with Gettysburg is that geologists like myself, with historian geologists like myself and other colleagues, we look at that and we're looking at why the battle may have been positive or negative depending on which side you're on in that sense. But probably the advice they're getting is not geological at the time. So we know that geology had an effect. So there we have two different things. The Apaches definitely knew what they were doing. The guys at Gettysburg had a vague idea what they're going on, didn't really know much was happening in terms of the ground. When we get to the trench warfare, we see something unique in terms of the scale of the fortress and of the trench systems that were being developed. And it had to rely, you can't just blunder through this. You have to deploy your specialists. You have to have people who know what they're talking about. Whether it be medical specialists, whether it be engaged with and get rid of pests in the trenches or water supply, or looking at the nature of the geology and the types of trench warfare. I mean, if you look at one thing that's fascinating is when you look at the evolution of the trenches in Flanders and you see, the shallow scrapes in the ground and the things which are tumbling in, the things that we're so well known to us, Paul, about how we see how the trenches have evolved. And then you look in late 1916 and into 1917, the prefabricated A-frame structures, which we've seen, actually in the field, dug out. We can see them as they were when archaeological investigations are carried out. I mean, those kinds of things show you just how engineers came up with a solution to combat the geological conditions, and that required you to understand the geology. When we did that work, Paul, we did the trenches of death work and tunnels of death, beg pardon, and we looked at that and machines, and we saw the way the Germans were handling that, a little bit ad hoc, a little bit imperfect, but you could see how they constantly tried to battle that against, and then how they came up to use concrete. So you can really see the evolution of it, and that means that trench warfare did, in Flanders in particular and on the Somme, did require much more understanding, much more use of specialists and combat specific issues. And that's why I think that was a revolution in military affairs, a real game changer. I think it's so good to be able to talk to you about this, Paul, because simply relying on something like Edmonds's book, which said it wasn't ever a swamp, conditions were like this, and yet the big flow of books beyond that have always gone back to Flanders was a swamp, and the men, you had to drain the swamp. It wasn't quite like that, and that's why the lessons that were learned during the war were probably lost in the 50s and 60s with the development of the sort of historiography of the 60s and the rejection of the war and its aims. So it's all bound together, but certainly unique, I would say, and game changing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating subject, and I think that you're right that I think it shows how our understanding of the Great War continues to evolve. And I think that in the last couple of decades, with the growth of conflict archaeology, has exposed this aspect of the war quite literally to a much wider audience, and people's understanding, I think, of battlefields is enhanced by the knowledge of what the geological effects were on the different battlefields.
That's absolutely right. And I think what's interesting is through the conflict archaeology. Conflict archaeology, as you know, has evolved. It started from an amateur approach and now is very much a technical approach, because obviously amateurs do some amazing work, but what we wanted to be able to do is to capture the knowledge and understand it. And I think so amateurs working with professional colleagues and the rest have developed something which is a phenomenal subject area. And there were, I think last year, I don't know, anyway, there was quite an interesting thread of discussion on Twitter as to what was the point of archaeology of the Great War. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask. Why do we need to know this? We've got the photographs, we've got the testimony, we've got the maps, we've got the aerial photographs, we've got the panoramic images, we've got every document that was needed to be written. We've got all of that in the archives. It goes on and on and on and on. And will we ever be able to see it all? I don't know, in our lifetime, certainly not from the German archives. But the one missing thing from all of that is that, remember the broad brush I was talking about, the big sweep? when you go and you do any of that work, as we've done together, and you look at some of those, each individual yard of trench and each individual part of the landscape is different. And so the archaeological aspect changes our impression completely. When the A19 road was mooted, and there's some work which I was involved in because of the All Party Group, which I'm the secretary, which came about because of that A19 road. Once the Flanders authorities stripped away the landscape, you saw the trenches, you'll have remember those, the trenches absolutely in front of us. And one of the fascinating things was that I had access to an archive of letters from an officer who occupied one of those trenches and who wrote home to his father to said, "Father, the trench here is, imperfect. I need to straighten it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my platoon company or whatever to do this." We were involved in excavation of that very trench, and we understood exactly what had happened to his men. He won the military cross in that area. And I think it's that connection of people's lives with the ground that, we both have. I think you step away from the nature of warfare, of being men on the ground in those conditions, and you step away from the reality. You go back into the reality. What we're striving to do is understanding what trench warfare was like, why it was fought, and how it was experienced. And I think that's what the additional layer of a battlefield archaeology is adding to this, because it really does open it up. It's not sufficient to just go on all the archive resources. It is important to link everything together. And I think that's where we're currently going in battlefield and conflict archaeology, which is an amazing thing to see unfold.
Absolutely. And I think it's that idea that the landscape is the last witness of the Great War, and that it is an important archive in that respect, that it's just as valid as unearthing files at the National Archives or going to the German archives in Stuttgart or wherever it is. And it's the answers that it's going to give us, we're not going to get anywhere else except by excavation and except by examination of the ground.
I 100% agree with you, Paul. And I think it's really interesting. And I do like that. I do like the idea of they are the mute witness. We are here to interpret what we see. And it's the same with objects and artifacts. For some people, they're a piece of rusty metal or a piece of junk or some fabric of, a past civilization almost. But for people like you and I have spent such a long time trying to understand and engage with this, every small aspect links directly, and we can link letters, diaries, effects, pieces of shrapnel balls, and the whole host of stuff to those interconnected engagements. And those, therefore, are all mute witnesses. Everything is recorded on that, and it's for us to try and tap into that recording. And I think that's why, for me, it's an honor almost to be able to use whatever skills I have to try and look at that landscape and to look beneath it and to see why conditions may vary, and to help others with their understanding, so that, as they look at it, they see that battlefront, as I say, the battle space being beneath and above and including. And I think we do have so much entrenched mythology that, of course, people find a challenge, and I can understand why, to break out of that. But we do, and I think if you go back to those ground, you stand with your own boots on the ground, and you experience that ground your own way, in however you wish to do so, you'll get a greater and fuller understanding. And fundamentally agree with you on all those fronts.
Well, Peter, I could talk to you all day about this. Thank you so much for your insights into the geology of the First World War. You can follow Peter on Twitter, and his book, Disputed Earth, published by Uniform Press, is still in print and highly, highly recommended.
Thanks very much, Paul. Pleasure talking to you.
No, thank you, Peter. It's been fantastic. We'll have you back again to talk about some other aspect of this in the future.
Believe me, I can talk forever. I would love to. Thank you.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe to us via your favourite podcast service. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore, and the podcast has its own Twitter feed now at Old Frontline Pod. and have a look at the podcast websites oldfrontline.co.uk. Until we meet again along the Old Front Line.